All right, welcome to our next interviewer or interviewee, Karen Lai. My name is Christine, and I'm part of a group called Wicked Connection, and it stands for Wish You Knew Education Connection. So basically, my sister, a friend, and we decided that we wanted to help students try to get into the correct career paths and educational path. And we wanted to do so through the power of mentors. And so right now I have Karen Lai. I'll get you to introduce yourself, your education, and your background, and maybe a little bit sort of how you got to where you are right now.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So, as Christine mentioned, my name's Karen, and I originally am from sort of Mississauga, Ontario, in Canada. In my undergrad, I actually went into urban planning at the University of Waterloo, and that was a program that was about 4.5, 5 years long with a bunch of co-op terms that I had worked in a bunch of municipal jobs as well as some private firms as well. After that, I worked for a couple years for a sustainability consulting firm, sort of providing consultation for lead and like sort of sustainability programs for new developments and existing buildings and stuff like that, which got me really interested in architecture. I was actually interested in architecture even in high school a little bit, but I guess working through that 2 years after my undergrad actually, I guess, sparked it a little more and got me back into the track of becoming an architect. And since then, I've also gone back to school for a master's program at the University of British Columbia, and that's in British Columbia, Canada. Um, and I just wrapped up the program earlier this year in May. And since then, I've just recently started working full-time at a local studio here in Vancouver. And essentially, that's where I am now. I just recently started working.
Awesome, thank you. It was first of all, just for everyone to know, she like reemphasize she recently graduated. So I guess can you tell us a bit about the life of a modern architect?
Yeah, sure. I guess there's no typical day of sort of being an architect. Every day it's very, very different. Because projects typically they could take up to like from design all the way to the actual construction and people moving into the building. It could take up to like 5 to 10 years, depending on how big the projects are, and even longer than that. So every day you're working on something different, working on a different stage of a project. A lot of, I think typically you would work on multiple projects depending on the firm. So you might work on 2 or 3 different projects at the same time, and they might be at different stages. One might be during design, where you get to do a lot more like drawings and sort of sketching, whereas or another project, you might be working more on the details and how like walls are built or how things are connected. And finally, there's also things like site visits that you actually get to go onto the construction site and see what's being built. Is it matching what you drew on your drawings, and things like that. And then other days you might be going to client meetings or meeting with consultants to figure out how the design of everything works, or trying to sell your products or your design to the client. So yeah, there's no short answer. Basically, it's just every day it's very different, which is what keeps it exciting.
Yeah, so that is really great. So what I'm hearing is that it's not like you're just stuck in your office drawing stuff or creating things. You actually go out and talk. And so, what are the skills that you say are the key ones you need to be a successful architect?
Um, it sort of ranges, I think, depending on the type of projects you work on, but also like the type of firm that you work with. Typically, I'd say you do want to have really good time management, and it really depends on, like, this is sort of where there's in my opinion, a bit of a disconnect between architecture school and the actual real world. In architecture school, and even applying for architecture school, they typically emphasize more of like the design or like conceptual thinking and drawing aspects. Whereas once you actually get into the real world, it's more about time management and getting things done and like knowing software and like technical details and things like that. So I'd say in general, time management is really, really important. You will be pulling long hours, especially near deadlines. Might be up, like hopefully not all night, but in school for sure, I pulled a few all-nighters to get projects done. And yeah, it's essentially, I think those two are the biggest ones.
Awesome. So I'm glad you mentioned about school and how it's different from work. And I think when we talk to a lot of our other mentors, that we hear the same thing. So I guess from a school perspective, what do you think is necessary in terms of helping students succeed in getting into architecture school, but also succeeding through architecture school?
Yeah, I think getting into architecture school, definitely one of the big things that schools look for is a portfolio. And so in that portfolio, you typically include like creative work that you've done, whether it's photography or model making, or even doing some drawings. Like in my portfolio, I had a lot of sketching and painting in it. And then I did, because I was applying to architecture school after my undergrad, I did have some projects in my urban planning program that I was able to also include in my architecture portfolio for my master's. I think depending on the school, they also sometimes require an interview. So at the interview, they just want to get to know you a little more and understand like if you're sort of the right fit for the school. It is very different, like different schools across, like I mostly applied for Canadian schools, but even schools in the US, they might have different requirements. So definitely I'd say look into each school that you're interested in and sort of their requirements. Some might require a portfolio, some might require interviews, some might not require either and just require like a high GPA. Yeah, so that's, I can't really have like a specific recommendation, but aside from that, I think in general, like make sure, look at the requirements that the school has for high school sort of educational or like courses that you need. So for example, some schools might need something like calculus and your like sort of higher level maths and maybe even physics and things like that. Or some schools might require high levels of English. Really depends. It's like sort of all over the map, but in general, it's those.
Oh, wow. I'm really surprised that they don't have like a consistent like course requirement, for example. Like for me going into a dental school, like there's a set like biology, chemistry, and all that kind of stuff. So what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that each school has their own kind of course requirement, and then portfolio is like one thing that they may or may not have. I guess, do they have a letter of intent or anything like that? Like what was the application process like for you at least?
Yeah, so for me, so I actually in my undergrad or before my undergrad, I did apply for undergrad in architecture as well. So that I applied to the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. And their process required an interview and a portfolio as well as like sort of your high school courses. So in that one, I believe it was mostly like math courses and English. But then for my master's, I ended up going into urban planning instead. But then for my master's, when I applied, it was only a portfolio process. There was no in-person interview. The portfolio was just, I believe at that point it was mailed in. I had to print and mail it over, but I think now it's all digital submissions. And then for my master's program, depending on the school, different schools will only take, like some schools like Waterloo will only take mostly architecture students from undergrad. So like, for example, if you studied architecture in your undergrad, you have a higher chance of getting into the school. Whereas University of British Columbia, which is the one I went to, they're sort of more diverse in a sense that you don't necessarily need to do architecture in your undergrad. And so I had a lot of classmates, and it was really great because like I had classmates that studied like psychology or math or photography, some even from like engineering and things like that. So in my first year, it was actually a pretty big eye opener of like everyone bringing in their diverse undergrad experience, and it was really cool to see how that affects and influences their work in first year, or even like the rest of their degree.
That is really, really cool. And so I guess maybe to clarify with students who are in, like high school students who are interested in architect, because now I'm hearing there's undergrad architect, but there's also like a master's. So is it always you need a master's in order to become an architect, or is there routes where you can go directly from high school?
Yeah, so typically, at least in Canada, you do need a master's degree in order to become licensed eventually. So the typical process would be to get an undergrad. It doesn't really matter what undergrad you get. If you get architecture, if you do an architecture undergrad, it might speed up your master's. So, for example, University of British Columbia, they have something called an advanced placement process. So, if you did an architectural degree in your undergrad at certain schools that they recognize, then you actually skip a year. So, instead of doing it in 3 years, it might only take you 2 years to finish your degree. For me, because I didn't have an architectural background, I did need to do the full 3 years. Um, and then after that, so you can get, in a way, any undergrad, then architecture masters. And then after that, there's still a process to get licensed. And that's essentially doing a bunch of hours, working hours in firms, getting experience and things like that. And for that, you have to sort of look at your local licensing board to see what their requirements are. So here in British Columbia, their requirements is, I believe, like 3,700-ish hours or something like that. So that is equivalent to about 2 or 3 years of working experience at a under a licensed architect before you can apply sort of for the board exams to become licensed. And once you become a licensed architect, that's when you can actually call yourself an architect. So for example, I cannot call myself an architect until I get licensed. So right now I'm, for example, an intern architect or just like a recent graduate kind of thing. So once you get licensed, then that's when you can start your own business if you would like, or you can stamp and seal drawings with a typical firm. For example, if you're building a hospital or something like that, you do need a licensed architect to stamp the drawings before they get approved by the city or go ahead with construction, things like that.
That is really cool, and I did not know that. So it's almost like it sounds like almost an internship in a sense when you talk about collecting all those hours. So then, if when you get all that, is this license only based in like UBC, or is it transferable to all across Canada and also like is it transferable across different like countries? Like for example, can you work as an architect in the States?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, not a super simple answer, but typically it's once you get licensed, so let's say I get licensed in British Columbia, I like there are reciprocities within Canada. So if I wanted to work in Ontario, for example, I could sort of transfer my license over. I think there are certain requirements that you would need to, like certain hurdles that you would have to go through in order to do that, but it's definitely a lot easier process than restarting all over again with the whole internship in Ontario. And then also for sort of working in the States and even overseas, there are certain sort of programs that make it a little easier. But again, you do still have to go jump through additional hurdles in order to practice in other states. Or even if, like, let's say you work in the States, different states have different requirements or different like boards and like licensing boards, and you can't necessarily practice in one, or like if you're in one state and you're licensed there, you would still have to do additional either courses or exams to practice in another state.
Oh wow, that sounds very, very complicated compared to maybe like medical school or dental degrees. So then, in that case, do you recommend that if people are seriously interested in architect and they know they want to, this is what they want to do like, would you advise them to choose an architect school in the area they wish to work in eventually, or do you like think, oh, it's still good, like anywhere to go is still fine, and then they could just apply after they graduate?
I think school-wise, it's definitely important to go to a school that you sort of like, I guess reputation is pretty important as well. Like some schools do focus more on like the theoretical side of architecture, whereas other schools are more on the practical side. So I would definitely prioritize that to what you want to do. Whereas the location, I would say, is not as important. You sort of still learn like typical like what is architecture. Like even in at UBC, like University of British Columbia, we are learning about European architecture or Japanese architecture. So I think it is sort of transferable, like the information and the courses are transferable. But if you for sure know like you do want to stay in, let's say, the Pacific Northwest, where like British Columbia is, for example, then that is very different. Like some of the more technical stuff is very different. And that's why they have different licensing boards, because designing and building in British Columbia, where the climate is maybe not as crazy as Ontario, where it's a lot colder, or even California, where it's never snowing, like those all require different considerations. So if you do know that you want to work in California, then I would recommend that you probably apply for a school in California, for example, instead of a school in Ontario where they're going to teach you how to design for snow.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I guess like in medicines, it's more like everybody's the same. The body illnesses and stuff like that are all the same, really. It doesn't really depend on geography. So what I'm hearing from you now is that like you're really good at math. You seem really good in physics. Really, it sounds like good in English. I'm like in art and was it geography. It sounds like you have to be good in so many subjects. So do you like, are there any key subjects, or like do you think someone who wants to go into architect, they feel like, oh, I'm not that great in physics, or I don't like this subject, like should they shy away from architect, or do you think they can still go and pursue that career?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. In a sense, architecture is, or architects are known as generalists, so they do need to know a bit of everything. So even when you're working full time, you are going to be interacting with engineers. You're going to need to understand how to read their engineering drawings, like electrical, mechanical drawings, where the ducts and stuff like that, where the switch is going to be. And then you're going to be have to have good marketing skills to be able to sell your ideas to the clients, and communication skills in that sense, as well as like I'd say math and physics, not necessarily as important. Like I like in high school, I did enjoy math and physics, but coming into architecture school, like you really only need basic math, like addition, multiplication, and a bit of trigonometry. But when it comes down to like crazy calculus math, like you don't really need that for architecture. And if anything, it's going to be your engineers that will do all the calculations for you and tell you whether your design will work or not. Because in the end, it's going to be them signing off on whether your building will stand up and things like that. And it's their liability. So in a way, like I don't necessarily need to be doing calculus or physics calculations on a daily basis. And then in high school, I was also pretty interested in arts and things like that. So I was doing a lot of like visual arts as well as media arts, and just to like spur up my creativity. It was something that I enjoyed, and something that definitely carried over into my master's and sort of practice now. I had also had the opportunity in high school to take a technological design course. So that course, the teacher at the time, Mr. Otoidi, he was, I believe, trained as an architect as well, but he never got licensed. So he did sort of, when I was taking this course, he did introduce us to a lot of drafting, woodworking with the wood shop that we had at the school, as well as a bit of I think our project in grade 12 was to design a cottage. And I remember he taught us how to use softwares like AutoCAD and Photoshop in order to like sort of design our homes, cottages, and also put in furniture and things like that. And I really thought that was super fun, which eventually, obviously, I tried getting into that sort of field. So yeah, that's.
So that's really great. So I'm glad to hear like of the different courses you took, and that hopefully this gives students some insight into what like courses they may want to choose to do before they graduate, and then hopefully those courses will help them like it has helped you. And then also in terms of I guess you had mentioned something about like UBC being more diverse in the sense that they accept people not from architect undergrad. So because you've had work experience, do you think it's a good idea to have work experience before you pursue an architect degree? Or like, I guess what are the pros and cons of going into as an undergrad architect versus like working a bit and then applying for the school?
Yeah, so personally, for me, I think because I had worked a couple years before applying for architecture school, it was definitely really helpful for me just to mature after graduating from undergrad, but also know sort of what I was getting myself into, and also what I wanted to do in the future. So I found things like, and even when I was at the University of Waterloo doing my undergrad in urban planning, I had a bunch of co-op jobs, and I was able to figure out like whether working for the city or the government is what I wanted to do, or whether it's a private firm where things are faster paced and might be working slightly longer hours, but in general, like I'm learning more and like it's just vibed with me a little more. And so definitely working the couple years afterwards was really helpful. One thing I do regret is that UBC had a co-op program that I could have done. And I sort of thought, no, I've done so many co-op jobs. I'm just going to try and like get through the program as soon as possible. And I think that was not necessarily a mistake, but something I do regret. Especially like we couldn't have known that COVID would have sort of killed the market this year, but it did take me quite a few months to find a full-time job after graduating. Whereas some of my classmates that did have working experience from before, from architectural firms, they were able to get jobs a lot, I wouldn't say a lot easier, but like a little bit easier because they can say that they've worked for a firm, an architectural firm. And all I could say was, oh, I've worked for a firm, but they weren't an architectural firm. They were just doing consulting.
Okay, that's really great advice. So I'm glad to hear that there's so many different paths to get into architect school. It's not just one way, and that even if you go pursue other ways, like you learn a lot. And I guess it really goes to just in general, like you can learn a lot from your experiences, and that's really really great. So when you say like I guess first of all, how big is your class, or how big is a typical class in architect? But then also, what type of work do you guys do? Is it a lot of collaboration, or is it more independent work? What kind of learner succeeds best?
Yeah, so my class, again, my incoming class into the architecture program was probably around between 60 to 80 students, but about half of them were advanced placement, which is what I mentioned earlier, where they actually skip first year and they go right into second year. So in the end, like the first year, like my core class that all started together in first year was around, I believe, 33 in my year. And I've heard that it's gotten a little bigger, and it also depends on the school. Some schools might take maybe 60 or 100 or even more, like depending on how much resources they have. And then as for typical school work, a lot of it is independent work, but there is definitely options or opportunities to collaborate. So so we have essentially in school, like our core course, you would say, is called Studio. So essentially that's one big design project for that you have the whole term, and you have maybe like 2 or 3 3-hour studio days where you're in class and like actually working on that design. So most of my time was always spent like on that studio course, and then you have more supplementary courses like structural design or structures and like more technical stuff that supplement it, and history obviously. But essentially it's all about the studio, and sometimes the studio courses are collaborative, so you can have like maybe work with 2 or 3 other people, or most of the time it is by yourself. One other course that I did end up taking an elective for was called design build. So with architecture, essentially a lot of times architects that graduate, they don't really have building experience, and that's something that is pretty important in a sense that you want to know when you're drawing stuff on paper and you're giving it to the contractor, they're going to be looking at your drawings and trying to figure out how to build what you're envisioning. And essentially, if you're just drawing stuff, but then it doesn't actually make sense, or that's not actually how things are put together, then there's that disconnect where your building might not end up coming out the way you want it to look. So by getting like sort of building experience, it's one way of sort of merging that connection and understanding how to draw stuff or what needs to be thought about. And so one elective I ended up taking was called design build. And essentially we designed the pavilion back in, I think, fall of 2018, I want to say. So it was 13 of us that were students, and we designed the pavilion on the UBC campus. And in the summer, I think May of 2019, we actually built the pavilion ourselves. So we were able to really go through the whole entire process that a typical architect might not get in the real world.
That is really cool. So something I'm learning new is that you actually have electives, and so that's really interesting. So in terms of your electives, I guess for like your master's degree, is it sort of like undergrad where you can take various elective courses, or is it like a group of elective courses that you could like choose from? And then also like, what's the lifestyle like? Is it, or work-life balance like? Because what if people, they decide to pursue this career later on in life, maybe they have a family or they have other stuff to do. Is it possible to do, or would you recommend they try to do it sooner after they had graduated from undergrad?
Yeah, okay. So hopefully I remember both questions. So the first question was more, okay, I forgot already.
The courses, like the type of courses.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so the elective courses, essentially, because I was in the sort of not advanced placement program, if I wanted to finish everything sort of on time, it was pretty, like the program itself was pretty strict in a sense that I had to take all of these core courses, and that left very little elective space for me. Most of the elective courses are over the summer, where you can choose to learn like program or take courses that are related to different softwares that you could learn, or like there was one course I think about housing and like different ways, like sort of I think they went on tours around Vancouver and looked at sort of different housing typologies and things like that. So for me personally, there wasn't much opportunity to take electives, but for the advanced placement students, they did have more options. So in order for me to actually take that elective, I actually had to take an additional course in addition to my typical term. So instead of 5 courses, I was taking 6 courses. Not sure if that's something I would recommend, but I got through it and ended up with a really cool building that I can show off. So that was, I guess, okay to suffer. As for, speaking of suffering, as for sort of the work-life balance, depends on the firm that you end up working for. Typically, architects are known to pull longer hours, and so you don't really have your typical like 9 to 4 sort of job where 4 o'clock you're out of the office. Typically, it does pick up around deadlines. So if you have a deadline coming up next week, you will be working longer hours. Sometimes like till 9, till 10, like overtime hours. But I'd say, yeah, it depends. If it's a small firm, you might be doing more hours than you would like. And so when it comes to doing architecture school, I would recommend doing it sooner rather than later. Some of my classmates in my master's program, they did have kids, or they did have families that they had to go back to, like spouses and things like that. But most of us were sort of in our 20s where we sort of didn't have much to go back to when we go home, especially since a lot of us were not from British Columbia, and like so our families were not in town anyways. So we essentially, with our program, we also get studio desks. So everyone gets a desk in a sort of big open office plan type of thing, and you can just go into the studio and do your work whenever you want. And so we started creating sort of our own little family within the studio space where we would always just be there. And that was really cool because we got to like know each other a little more, and we just became really close in general. So yeah, hopefully that answers the questions.
Yeah, it does. And actually, that's really great. The fact that you mentioned about how a lot of students in your program were actually not from British Columbia. So I guess that's one thing in terms of now when if someone's looking across different architect schools in Canada, they can like count that in as a factor, especially if they're not from Canada, or just even if they're, I guess maybe ranking. Actually, in that case, I do have a question in terms of when you choose a program. Or when you're applying for a program, when you get the acceptance, is it all the acceptance given at once, or are all the deadlines the same, or is it all different? Like, how did that go, and then how did you end up like choosing your program? What factors I guess you considered?
For that, it might be a little different between undergrad and masters, and also between different countries. So I remember in Ontario, we all had to get our applications in, I believe, before like November or December-ish, like the year before. And then they generally would, like there was this whole website that we would go on, you would apply through that, and then it would track sort of each university's sort of like acceptances and stuff like that all on the website. So you can go on there and see, oh, I've been accepted to this school and this school, but then I'm still waiting on this one. And I think there was sort of a general deadline that was given with the Ontario program. As for when I applied for the master's here at UBC, I did apply for the University of Toronto in Ontario, and I also applied for University of British Columbia. And from what I remember, things were not necessarily as aligned. And if you're going to be applying for even the states, or like different states might have different timelines or deadlines. So yeah, there's like I can't really speak for outside of Ontario, unfortunately. But I'd say like if you are concerned about the timelines, maybe like email or call the specific universities or the programs themselves and sort of at least get a general idea of when the deadlines are. And I know like obviously if you're going to be applying for, let's say, like Australia or something, like their like schedules are totally different. So you might be like waiting on something that you might not hear from for another like 5 months, and you have to accept something tomorrow. So it can be a little tougher if you're going to be applying across different countries.
Really great advice there. So I guess you have been successful in both your undergrad and then your master, and now you've got a job. So what are the things that you felt looking back now that you did well and you would continue to do if you had to do this all over again? And then what are the things that you would not do maybe, or you would change up in terms of if you were to apply all over again for like undergrad and then master and then work?
Yeah, for sure. I think the path that I ended up taking, where I did do a bunch of co-op terms, as I mentioned earlier, was really, really helpful. And again, that's something that I wish I had done even more in my master's. There are also opportunities to study abroad. I did one in undergrad where I actually went to Spain, Barcelona, for a couple weeks. It was only a summer exchange program, but in at UBC, they with the architecture program, every year they sort of have a different maybe place that they go to. So I think last year or 2 years ago, a bunch of students went to Sweden for a whole term and they studied there for 4 months. So that was like experiences like that, I think is something that I wish I had taken more opportunities in, especially since it does get you sort of like exposed to more than just what you're usually like your current location. Because, for example, BC has a very unique type of architecture compared to Europe or compared to Japan or Asia, like Chinese culture, for example. So like I think more experiences in traveling is something that I can never get enough of. I have done my own personal trips to Europe, for example, just to like sort of see the architecture there, but also just to explore and like get different insights into sort of how different cultures live and use spaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I guess we're closing into our interview. So any last words of advice you would give for anyone interested in this field?
Mm, I think in general, like don't be afraid of architecture. It is like it can sound very intimidating, especially when it comes to like knowing a bit of everything. But I think just like as you go through the program, you're going to sort of retain a lot of the information anyways. Like you're gonna learn so much, and it honestly keeps like every day super interesting and exciting. And I really can't see myself like doing any other career really, because it's just a blend of everything that I was interested in as I was growing up, for example, the arts and physics and math and things like that. So if, let's say, you're not necessarily interested in architecture, for those students, I think really just like don't worry about sort of cultural expectations, don't worry about like money in a way. Just like worry about what you really want to do, what your interests are, and try to figure out a career path that matches that. Because the worst thing you can do is work a really high paying job, but then you're dreading going to work every day. You really should want to be at work, like enjoy the time you're spending there and also your coworkers and things like that. So, yeah, that's my advice.
Thank you. That's really, really great advice, and really, that advice can literally apply to any jobs and any field. So I really hope people were able to learn something new, and maybe hopefully from what you said, they'll be able to better figure out for themselves if this is the right career path. So thank you again so
Mhm.
much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, bye.
Bye.